How long will an anti-tank rifle last if it only has 6 boxes of cartridges? It's no good against 200 or 300 tanks. That's why many of our soldiers threw themselves under tanks with grenades. It was sheer desperation. And many of our troops had no proper weapons at all, just a spade and a knife.
9th of August 1942. Shumilov's counterattack began at dawn at 0400 hours with a heavy artillery bombardment, surprising the Germans and catching them off guard. In addition to divisional artillery, 2 separate artillery regiments, a separate artillery battalion, the 76th Katyusha Rocket Artillery Regiment, and 1 armoured train from the 28th Armoured Train Battalion were in support of the attack and fired away. Falk says that this armoured train battalion was armed with a variant of the BP-43 train. But since the BP-43s were designed in 1943, and this was 1942, these were probably prototypes or non-standard variants of the previous armoured train types. Either way, the train here was equipped with 4 T-34 tank turrets sat on 4 artillery cars, each with 76mm guns, as well as anti-aircraft guns and a host of other machine guns. This added considerable weight to the shells and rockets now raining down on Kempf's men. Heim's 14th Panzer Division and Fremery's 29th Motorised Division were battered from 3 sides. First by the bombardment, then by Soviet infantry and tank attacks. Zorokin's 126th Rifled Division and the 254th Tank Brigade charged at 29th Motorised Division from the Abgan-Yerevo station area. Simultaneously, Skvortsov's 204th and Voska-Boynikov's 208th Rifled Divisions, plus the Krasnodar Cadet Regiment, supported by 6th Guards Tank Brigade, struck 14th Panzer Division's forces from the north. At Tingutta, other portions of 14th Panzer Division were swarmed by Safyulin's 38th Rifled Division, supported by the KV tanks of the 133rd Heavy Tank Brigade and the remainder of the 13th Tank Brigade not committed to the west. These were supported by the guns of the second and final train from the 28th Armoured Train Battalion. Maria Dolgopolova was a 17-year-old nurse with 13th Tank Corps during these attacks.
It was difficult to fight. The terrain was open. The fascists ruled the skies. It was impossible to carry ammunition, water, and food to the front line and evacuate the wounded. The battle at Tondutovo was indescribable. The sky was dark, and the air was full of dust from the explosions of fascist bombs. There was no air to breathe. The burnt corpses of horses and cattle lay about. An armoured train that came up from Sarepta was very helpful. It fired very accurately at the fascists' front line and shot down several aircraft. The fascist pilots bailed out of their burning aircraft without parachutes because they were not issued any at Stalingrad. They did not want them to be captured.
These attacks were heavy, so heavy in fact that they compelled the German Bulge to fall back in the mid-morning. Battered and bruised, German forces formed a new line that evening. The Germans fled in panic from Plodevite. In this fight, up to 60 enemy tanks were destroyed and 40 captured, as well as dozens of guns. Many fascists were taken prisoner. The casualty list for Kampfgruppe Kant was certainly long. 129th Panzer Battalion had lost 43 men, including their commander Major Gradl, the day before, and had permanently lost over a dozen panzers in the previous few days, a significant portion of which were taken on this day. Heim's 14th Panzer Division, with 3 panzer battalions, was down to just 24 operational tanks, which happened to be the same number that 129th Panzer Battalion had at that time. Yes, a panzer division now had as many tanks as a motorised division. It's no wonder these units, 36th Panzer Regiment and 129th Panzer Battalion, had withdrawn to more defensive ground. It's not clear if they did lose the 100 panzers in this one fight, as Shumilov claimed, or if they had lost this number over a period of days. And it does appear that Heim's men repaired a good number of the tanks, but clearly the Germans had come away from the fighting around Tengutta as the losers. Trying to relieve pressure on 29th Motorized Division, the Romanians along the Axe River attacked Kuropatyenka's 157th Rifle Division near Zalivsky. However, their assault ground to a halt after sustaining heavy casualties. In addition, the Luftwaffe were called in to tackle one of the armoured trains in support of Shumilov's attack. The train, number 667, in support of the 38th Rifle Division, shot down 2 German aircraft before being knocked out by bombs. Several rail cars were destroyed, and the train was put out of action for 2 days while it was being repaired. To the north, the Germans were systematically hunting down Soviet survivors inside the Kalach pocket, going so far as to set the brush on fire to burn them out. The Soviets launched breakout attempts inside the ever-shrinking Kalach pocket, and some units did get out. Volkin and Zazhin had formed a second battle group to do the same as Udvenka and Novikov had done previously, this time heading towards the southeast in a breakout attempt. But by this point, the Germans had finally formed a line to block the escape routes, and these divisions could not break through. In the end, the men hid inside the bulkers and other terrain features, doing their best to tend to the wounded and trying to figure a way out of their trap. Unable to punch their way to freedom with sheer weight of numbers, small and scattered Soviet units filtered through the German lines to get back to the east. Those that did escape joined the other fleeing survivors at the Don River. They then abandoned their equipment and swam across to the relative safety of the eastern bank. Kalach was turning out to be a significant victory for the Germans. However, the fall of Kalach convinced the Soviet leadership that a climactic battle in the Stalingrad region was imminent. Having realised his previous mistake, Stalin conceded to Yeremenko's requests and granted permission for a reorganisation of the Red Army command structure in the area to unify the defence of Stalingrad under one headquarters. But this change of heart was limited, and the command structure remained needlessly more complicated than it ought to have been. Yeremenko became commander of the overall Stalingrad defence, but had to operate through 2 separate front headquarters, the Stalingrad Front and the Southeastern Front. Golikov became deputy commander of the Southeastern Front, and both Golikov and Gordov subordinated themselves to Yeremenko. Complicated, but it was better than nothing. Plus, 1st Guards Army was now ordered to reinforce Stalingrad Front's right wing and began riding into the area by rail. These reinforcements would assist with Yeremenko's task. Of course, the major news of the 9th of August 1942 didn't take place in the Stalingrad region at all. Much further to the south in the Caucasus, the oil centre of Mayakop, a major objective of the Fall-Blau campaign, fell into Axis hands. This was a significant blow to the Soviets. However, Stalin himself had told Deputy Oil Commissar Nikolai Babikov that if he didn't destroy the oil fields at Mayakop before the Germans captured them, he would be shot. The Soviets therefore ensured that the oil fields were destroyed, so thoroughly in fact that even the Germans were impressed by the effort that they went to do it. This action prevented the Germans from extracting any oil for the time being, and Goering, who was in charge of portions of the German economy, including the German oil companies, predicted that it would take 6 months before they got any oil from Mayakop. Still, this was a major strategic victory for the Germans, whose own oil situation was desperate, and overall, it was an economic disaster for the Soviets. 10th of August 1942. By now, Kempf's attack had well and truly come to a halt, and Shumilov's counterattack had largely been successful. The Germans in the area were digging into their new fallback positions as Soviet forces continued to put pressure on them. To the north, the Kalach pocket continued to shrink, with skirmishes occurring in the Balkans as Soviet units decided to either filter out of the pocket or try to avoid capture. Colonel Sajin was killed near a farm as his division disintegrated. The Soviets in their self-made pocket to the south also launched break-in attacks as well, with one of these attacks catching the artillery batteries of 71st Infantry Division by surprise. Towards 0300 in the morning, we drew fire from our right front from over the Don. It was almost exclusively small arms fire. None of us found it very alarming. This drowsy congeniality came to an abrupt end when a mounted messenger galloped up and informed us that the Russians had crossed the Don and overrun 11th Battery on the road ahead of us. Where was the Stabs Battery and the 12th? No idea. What should we do? It was too risky to continue moving forward. Should we turn around, run away? Worcester decided to set up his artillery and managed to locate a Soviet crossing point over the Don. His guns suppressed it with fire, helping to ease the pressure on 11th Battery. It turned out that 11th Battery had been ambushed while on the march and had been overrun. Their commander had rallied and employed his men as infantry to stave off the Soviets. Now though, finding out that the Soviets were heading their way, it was the turn of Worcester's 10th Battery. I instructed the gun commanders to use direct fire, assigned ammunition carriers, and set up a rifle corps, which would open fire with rifles as soon as possible. Only the drivers stayed under cover near their horses. When the first figures appeared on the road, silhouetted against the morning sky, I hesitated briefly in order to be absolutely certain that they actually were Russians and not some of our people falling back. I issued the command which I had heard so many times before as a gun commander in Poland. Gun commanders, distance 1,000 meters, open fire! The spell was lifted. The frog in my throat was gone. The 4 rounds coming out of 4 barrels were almost as tight as a single shot. Before they were even reloaded, my riflemen and machine gunners had already begun firing. This was Worcester's first action against Soviet forces at Stalingrad, and his first as a battery commander. It was also the first time his men had been in close combat, and none of them had infantry training. But nonetheless, the Soviets were pushed back, and we'll be hearing more of Worcester's actions in the future. Still, despite their effort to resist, the 112th Rifle Division and Co. continued to be squeezed in their self-imposed pocket. The increasing pressure was too much, and the division routed. Colonel Ivan Sologub was killed, and his men on the western bank tried to swim to safety. After the crossing, the division had just 1,924 men left, but 847 of those were from the artillery regiment, which seems to have been on the eastern bank anyway, meaning that most of the division's troops on the western bank did not survive. In 5 days, 112th Rifle Division had lost 6,183 men and its commander. Catastrophic losses.
The Germans were really pressing up against us. It was August 10th, 1942. We were almost surrounded, but the division commander had not received the order to retreat. He was a colonel. Later, he'd swim across the river like all of us. There were so many untended wounded. I was bandaging their wounds together with the field nurse. We did what we could, tearing strips from shirts and using them as bandages. So many died there. One lost his arm and died before making it to the crossing. Just fell down. Our radio operator too. Our girls, as they were climbing up the bank, got hit too. They were screaming, calling for their mothers. Torn limbs were flying from the blasts. It was terrifying. The most horrible is not the shelling itself, but to see its result.
And civilians were also caught up in the fighting.
My brother, Andrei, fought from the beginning of the war, and in July 1942 was wounded on the other side of the Don and hospitalized in Kalach. Mama went to visit him there and fell ill herself. They evacuated both of them from Kalach under German bombing and strafing.
Considering that Soviet forces were being squeezed, it now didn't take quite so many German units to hold the ring of the Kalach pocket. And since Paulus recognised that Hort's 4th Panzer Army was struggling against the 64th Army, he ordered Pfeffer's 297th Infantry Division to march south. So they began to break away, and would hopefully give 4th Panzer Army additional strength to resume its advance, although it would take a few days for them to march there. In addition, Weitersheim's 14th Panzer Corps was ordered to move north to reinforce Heitz's 8th Army Corps, currently facing 4th Tank Army's bridgehead on the Don Bend. Paulus was about to put Kryuchenkin in the line of fire. As the fighting was raging in the Don region, the Stalingrad Defense Committee were busy preparing their city for what was ever more likely to come their way. The construction of defences around Stalingrad had actually begun in the October of 1941, with Komarovsky's 5th Sapper Army doing the first digging. However, thousands of civilians had also participated in such work. They had to remove more than 20 million cubic meters of earth from the anti-tank ditches and trenches, build hundreds of defensive fortifications, and in place thousands of firing points and reinforced concrete and earth and log pillboxes along a defensive line that extended hundreds of kilometers. More than 220,000 labourers were mobilised for this work from among the workers, kolkosniks, service personnel, students and housewives, along with 1,400 tractors, 516 trucks and 7,400 carts. 400 T-26 turrets were emplaced into the defensive network, command posts, steel shields for machine guns, and anti-tank barricades were erected. And all this was just for one of the defensive lines. 4 such lines surrounded Stalingrad. The second line was started in the winter of 1941, and a third was dug by July 1942, with 250,000 people having been involved in the process. By this point, 85,000 firing positions had been created, and 1,600 pillboxes. But, despite this colossal effort, the war so far had been a disaster for the Soviets. The city of Stalingrad was now overflowing with refugees from the Ukraine and other parts of the Soviet Union that had been conquered by the Germans. The roughly 400,000 inhabitants of Stalingrad were joined by thousands more. A conservative estimate says the city population had swelled to 550,000, while others put it at 900,000, or even as high as 1 million. Either way, a lot of people were in the city, and there were a lot of troops in the area as well. Of course, feeding this many mouths was clearly an issue, and we've seen that there was a shortage of food throughout the Soviet Union at this stage. The organs of the state hadn't organised themselves effectively, and supplies of both food and ammunition were not reaching the troops in sufficient quantities in the Stalingrad region. So now the Stalingrad Defense Committee ordered the nearby collective farms to hand over their grain reserves to the Red Army. In addition, the NKVD had taken over the river, and were prioritizing the supply and movement of the army rather than the consumers. And during this early period of the fighting outside the city, some of the refugees and regular civilians were sent to the Gulag slave labour camps, if the authorities deemed them to have failed, for one reason or another, to fulfill their patriotic duty to the motherland. But then Stalin got involved and decided that the troops and the new city militia units being raised would fight better if they knew that the civilians behind them couldn't evacuate to safety. So Stalin therefore forbid any evacuation of civilians from Stalingrad. So yes, the state wants you to stay and die, so you must stay and die. Martial law was declared on the 14th of July 1942. School children and their teachers, women, the rural population, refugees from the Ukraine, and old people were handed shovels and baskets and marched onto the steppe around Stalingrad. In the baking heat of that summer, they were obliged to dig 6-foot deep anti-tank ditches for a 4th defensive line. Others lay anti-personnel and anti-tank mines. We worked 18 to 20 hours per day. There were enemy air raids, but we had anti-aircraft positions nearby, and they fended off the enemy attacks.
We dug from morning to night, until we had bloody calluses and were dead on our feet. Despite our exhaustion, late in the evening we danced and sang to the music of accordions and balalaikas.
The reality was that the orders for digging the 4th line of defence around the city came too late. Most positions weren't finished in time. Worse, the defences were placed too far to the west of the city. Krylov believed that if they had been closer to the city, they would have been more useful in the end. And jumping ahead slightly, it turned out that these defences, for the most part, had little to no effect in stalling or even slowing Axis forces in their advance to the city, so a lot of this effort was a complete waste. Nonetheless, women installed anti-aircraft guns on both banks of the Volga, and then operated them. It was hoped that these would offer Stalingrad some protection from Richthofen's Luftflotte 4, although the occasional German bomber was already targeting parts of the city. All this was going on as the state swamped the civilians' eyes with anti-German and anti-fascist propaganda. It's worth bearing in mind that the Third Reich was not fascist, it was National Socialist. In addition to the anti-German and anti-nationalist socialist rhetoric, and despite the lack of preparation or organisation, the Marxist International Socialist regime was now bent on turning Stalingrad into a symbol of nationalist spirit. As Mussolini had realised many years before, nationalism had a stronger appeal in the hearts of men than internationalism did. Well, the same thing applied here, and Stalin now placed himself and his city, Stalingrad, at the centre of a nationalist and patriotic surge. And the people rallied behind him for the defence not of international socialism, but for their new National Socialism. But don't worry, this is real National Socialism, not like the enemy, who were fascists. This is probably the reason they refer to the enemy as fascists rather than National Socialists, so as to not confuse the people about the nature of their own regime. And despite the irony, the people just ate this all up, even though things looked bleak. To be honest with you, there was considerable uncertainty about the fate of the city, whether we could hold it or not. And yet, after Order 227, we felt that we had to hold out at Stalingrad regardless of that uncertainty. Somehow we had to make our stand there. You see, the soil was now precious to us, and we had to defend every metre of it, It was our promise to the motherland. And the motherland was dying. On the 11th of August 1942, the Jews of Rostov-on-Don were ordered to assemble, having been told that they would be resettled to a ghetto. They were forced onto trucks and driven to the Zmyovska Balka, or Snake Ravine, where they were either shot or gassed in vans. At least 2,000 were murdered on the first day, although the death toll could be many thousands higher. Among those who died was 56-year-old Sabina Spielrein, one of the first female psychoanalysts in history, a pioneer of the field who influenced Sigmund Freud, and a friend or possible lover of Carl Jung. Sabina and her two daughters, Imre, aged 29, and Yeva, aged 16, were shot by Einsatzgruppe D, along with thousands more Jews and others over the next few days. Around 2.7 million Jews would be murdered in 1942, the majority in the east by the National Socialist death squads of the SS. Millions of Soviet prisoners had already died, and millions more innocent civilians were planned to be starved to death to make room for German settlements in the east, Lebensraum. So the fate of millions of people hung in the balance at Stalingrad. 11th of August 1942. In Sixth Army's area, the surviving Soviet elements inside the Kalach pocket surrendered, although it would take another day or so to mop them all up. In the final effort, after 3 weeks of trying to destroy the 62nd Army, Paulus claimed to have taken 35,000 Soviet prisoners, 270 tanks, and 560 artillery pieces. Some of the other German generals claimed even higher numbers, with Richthofen saying 50,000 prisoners and 1,100 tanks, and Strecker claiming 52,000 prisoners and 1,000 tanks. But these guesses are too high. Counting all the Soviet soldiers who had surrendered in the previous 18 days, there was only somewhere in the region of 75,000 prisoners taken, with one estimate saying 57,000. And we know that the 62nd Army had less than 300 tanks to oppose Paulus on the 7th of August. So in the space of 5 days, they couldn't have lost more than 3 times as many tanks as they had at the beginning. But since the fighting had begun in late July, the Germans had taken out around 1,000 Soviet tanks, and the Don area that they had fought over was now being referred to by the Germans as the Panzerfriedhof, tank graveyard. Knocked out or abandoned Soviet tanks littered the battlefield, with some German panzers thrown into the mix as well. 3rd Motorized Division alone during the course of the Battle of Kalach had taken out or captured 288 Soviet tanks, as well as a host of other equipment. The Kalach Kessel, almost forgotten today, was the first real encirclement of the 1942 campaign, and led to high hopes in Hitler's headquarters. Hitler was ecstatic. He had envisioned a series of classic double envelopments like this when planning Blau, but this was the first encirclement of any significance actually accomplished so far. The Germans thought they'd won a spectacular victory, similar to those in 1941. But this battle hadn't been as decisive as Paulus had hoped. The reality was that 6th Army's advance had been stalled for over a week, and only after additional reinforcements, regrouping and restocking their fuel and ammunition supplies, were they able to achieve their objective. Even then, the Germans hadn't had it all their own way. For example, the Jaegers had suffered 600 killed in action and 1,200 wounded in the past 2 weeks of combat. 24th Panzer Division had also seen a decrease from 116 operational tanks to just 82, a pretty heavy toll. Worse, although they had done a lot of damage to the 62nd Army, they hadn't actually destroyed all of the Soviet formations. After running out of anti-tank ammunition, the wounded commander of 33rd Guards Rifle Division, Colonel Utvenka, hid in a field of sunflowers until it went dark. Then he and about 120 others escaped the pocket, reached the bank of the Don, and somehow got across. The 181st Rifle Division suffered a similar fate, with only 105 men reaching safety. But, in fact, most of the soldiers of the 112th, 131st, and 196th Rifle Divisions, and most of the 23rd and 28th Tank Corps had managed to escape across the Don as well. Yes, they did have to leave a significant portion of their tanks and equipment behind, but about half of the 62nd Army had actually swam to safety. Again, not quite as decisive a victory as appeared on paper. It was a crushing tactical defeat for the Red Army. Strategically, however, the sacrifice of 62nd Army was a ruthlessly canny move. 14 invaluable days had been gained to strengthen Stalingrad's defences. If the Germans had crossed the Don in early August, nothing of substance would have stood in their way as they rolled across the steppe to Stalin's namesake city. And as 6th Army was counting its losses, to the south, Kempt's 48th Panzer Corps had been bloodied as well. Hort's 4th Panzer Army had been stopped, and more than that, it had been defeated after just a week of fighting. There was now no hope of reaching Stalingrad from the south. In Glantz and Hauss's opinion, a carefully planned advance by inadequate forces had failed to achieve its objective. And by splitting Army Group South in two, and sending half of it into the Caucasus earlier than planned, Hitler had stretched his armies too thin. However, the Soviets had been battered, and with the defeat of their forces at Kalach, the Germans still held the initiative. At this moment, Stalingrad looked vulnerable, which was why a group of senior officials had just arrived in the Stalingrad area from Moscow. Vasilevsky, the Stavka's representative, Malenkov, one of Stalin's political henchmen, and Novikov, the Red Air Force chief, were here to supervise Yeremenko. Vasilevsky and Yeremenko planned the defence of Stalingrad between the 9th and 12th of August. They correctly concluded that the Germans would now try to eliminate Kryuchonkin's 4th Tank Army in its bridgehead, before they advanced towards Stalingrad. Kalach seemed the obvious choice for the starting point of an advance towards Stalingrad, but 6th Army Command did not think that this direction was the most suitable because the terrain between the two was furrowed with deep gullies that was unsuitable for tanks and offered excellent defensive positions. Some 30 kilometers to the north, the terrain was much more suited to armoured forces. They also concluded that the advance to Stalingrad would be made in two groups, one from Kalach with around 10 divisions, and a second from the Plodavite region with 5 to 7 divisions. Therefore, they decided to create a defence in depth around the city. While Yeremenko and Vasilevsky prepared their defences, Paulus regrouped his forces. The German command seemed to be aware that their victory wasn't total, and realised that the Soviets would send in more and more reinforcements into the area to replenish the losses that they'd sustained. With this, and the logistical crisis in the back of their minds, they called for more haste, more speed. Paulus and Hort had to get to Stalingrad now, before Soviet reinforcements prevented them from doing so. With Hort's attack stalled, the previously released 297th Infantry Division, and now the 24th Panzer Division as well, were sent south to reinforce 4th Panzer Army, giving them additional forces for the next attack, planned to continue on the 18th. To the north, Paulus recognised that the only way to get his own attack towards Stalingrad going again would be to clear the remaining Soviet forces on the western bank of the Don, specifically 4th Tank Army in its northern bridgehead. So, Paulus began shifting forces in preparation for this attack. Weitersheim's, Strecker's and Seidlitz's corps all moved north to reinforce Heitz's 8th Army Corps, and in total, Paulus concentrated 11 divisions, 1 panzer, 2 motorized, and 8 infantry for the next offensive. Facing this huge arrangement of forces was Kryuchunkin's 4th Tank Army, with just 6 divisions. In support of this woefully understrength force, bearing in mind that 184th and 192nd Rifle Divisions had already been defeated in July and forced to fall back north in the wake of Weitersheim's advance, was Shamshin's battered 22nd Tank Corps, with a total of just 45 tanks. There was also the 54th Fortified Region, basically an artillery and machine gun force, and the 5th Destroyer Brigade, both defending the northern bank of the Don River. So, basically not a lot. 4th Tank Army was only a tank army in name, and, to quote Glantz, was indeed ripe for rapid defeat.